Our colleagues, Ken Delaney and Vaughn Hilliard, are covering this developing story since we've been on the air, and I want to share this update to their reporting. They report that Deputy FBI Director Dan Bongino is considering leaving his job after this heated confrontation with Attorney General Pam Bondi over his frustration with how the Justice Department has handled the Jeffrey Epstein files. That's according to a person who's spoken with Bongino and a source familiar with Bongino and FBI Director Kash Patel's interactions with Bondi. Quote, Bongino is out of control, furious. The person who has spoken with the Deputy FBI Director said, quote, this destroyed his career. He's threatening to quit and torch Pam unless she is fired.
Okay, so a New York judge just did something to Donald Trump that has left his entire legal team completely blindsided, and it involves hundreds of millions of dollars that Trump is now required to pay immediately, no negotiations, no payment plans, and a very real threat of prison if he tries to dodge it. This is the civil fraud case, the one where Trump was found to have deliberately inflated the value of his assets for years in order to get loans from banks on better terms than he was actually entitled to. The case where the original judgment came in at over $500 million before the appeals process brought that number down. Well, the appeals court did reduce the dollar amount, but it upheld the core finding that fraud took place. And now, on November 24, 2025, a judge has ordered Trump to pay the full remaining judgment of $364 million. Not spread out over time, not broken into installments, not after another round of appeals. Right now. And the judge made it absolutely clear any failure to pay, any attempt to hide assets or find a way around this order could result in imprisonment. Trump's legal team apparently walked into that courtroom fully expecting to negotiate some kind of payment schedule. They walked out staring down immediate enforcement and the very real possibility of their client going to jail. This is what accountability actually looks like when a judge finally runs out of patience with delay tactics. The total amount Trump owes, $364 million, includes the original judgment plus interest that has been building up every single day while Trump has been fighting this in court. Every day he chose to delay, every motion his lawyers filed, every appeal he pursued. The clock was ticking and the interest kept growing, and now every last dollar of it is due immediately. This is a staggering amount of money, even for someone who constantly claims to be as wealthy as Trump does. Coming up with $364 million in cash right now is not something you can simply write a check for, even if you genuinely are a billionaire. You have to liquidate investments. You have to sell off properties. You have to find that cash somewhere, fast. And if you cannot find it, if you cannot pull together $364 million on demand, then your assets start getting seized. Properties like Mar-a-Lago, Trump Tower, the golf courses, all of it is potentially on the table. The judge has made clear this judgment will be enforced. Trump has no more room to stall, no more room to delay. That window is closed. The broader context of this order makes it even more damaging. Back in August of 2025, the appeals court threw out the larger $515 million penalty that had originally been imposed. Trump celebrated that publicly as a victory. He claimed vindication. He suggested to his supporters that the whole case was unraveling. But what he did not highlight, what his supporters did not hear, was that the appeals court upheld the core fraud findings entirely. The court said yes, Trump committed fraud. Yes, he inflated his asset values to deceive banks. Yes, he should face consequences for that. They simply reduced the dollar amount of those consequences. The fraud finding was not overturned. The judgment was not thrown out. And now, 3 months later, that judgment is being enforced, and enforced hard. The appeals court did not rescue Trump from accountability. It just trimmed the bill slightly. And now the full remaining bill is due, immediately, with the threat of prison hanging over him if he tries to avoid paying it. And this order is landing on top of everything else we have already been covering. The Supreme Court ruling against Trump in the FTC firing case. The unanimous rebuke from 29 judges in the 7th Circuit. The blocks placed on his National Guard deployments, the contempt situation involving Judge Boasberg, the repeated defeats on birthright citizenship. Trump is facing legal pressure coming at him from every direction at once. And now, piled on top of all of that, he has to find $364 million immediately, or face having his assets seized and potentially ending up in prison. His ability to access liquid cash is being crushed. His business empire is under siege. His ability to fund his political operation going forward is under serious threat. The civil fraud judgment that had started to feel like old news, a leftover from a previous legal battle, has suddenly roared back to life. The judge's order to pay now, with no delays and no negotiations permitted, has turned what might have been a manageable financial problem into an existential threat to Trump's entire financial operation. All right, let's really dig into what this civil fraud case is actually about and why this enforcement order carries so much weight. The case goes back to an investigation conducted by New York Attorney General Letitia James, who found that Trump and the Trump Organization had been systematically lying about the value of their assets for years. Properties were listed as being worth far more than they actually were. Financial statements handed to banks painted a picture of Trump's wealth that simply did not reflect reality. And those inflated numbers were then used to obtain loans on favorable terms, loans Trump may never have qualified for if the banks had been given an accurate picture of what his assets were actually worth. That is fraud. That is lying to financial institutions to get money you might not otherwise be entitled to. And New York State took Trump and his organization to court to recover the benefits they obtained through that deception. The original trial produced crushing findings against Trump. The judge concluded that Trump had engaged in persistent fraud, not an isolated mistake, not a one-time error in judgment, but a deliberate and systematic pattern of deception carried out over many years. The judgment included not just financial penalties, but also a 3-year ban on Trump holding any leadership role at New York businesses and a ban on obtaining loans from New York State financial institutions. These are serious, concrete restrictions that significantly limit Trump's ability to operate in the very state where he built his entire business empire. The financial penalty, originally set at over $500 million, was designed to strip away the profits Trump gained through his fraudulent conduct. The underlying principle is straightforward. You should not be allowed to keep the benefits of your fraud. You lied and cheated to gain advantages, and now you have to give those advantages back. The appeals process brought that penalty down from over $500 million to $364 million, but left everything else completely intact. The fraud findings were upheld. The business restrictions were upheld. The core conclusion that Trump deliberately deceived banks and personally profited from that deception was fully affirmed. Trump tried to spin the reduction in the dollar amount as vindication, as proof that the case against him had been exaggerated. But a $364 million judgment is not vindication by any stretch. It is a massive financial blow, and the appeals court was explicit the fraud happened. They simply calculated the financial damages using a different method. Trump remains a proven fraudster under New York law. He just owes slightly less than he was originally ordered to pay. That is not a win. That is a smaller loss. And now that smaller loss has come due all at once, with no further opportunity to delay. The judge's November 24th order rejected every remaining delay tactic Trump's legal team had left to try. By all accounts, Trump's lawyers had walked into that courtroom expecting to negotiate a payment schedule to work out some kind of arrangement that would allow Trump to pay in stages over time, rather than all at once. They went in thinking they were going to have a structured conversation about payment terms. Instead, they were handed an order for immediate, full payment in its entirety, with no negotiations allowed and no exceptions made. The judge was done with the motions, done with the appeals, done with every attempt to push accountability further down the road. The time to pay had arrived. Trump had to pay the full amount right now, or face enforcement action, up to and including imprisonment for attempting to evade the judgment. Trump may have assets on paper properties that are theoretically worth billions of dollars, but converting those assets into actual usable cash quickly is extremely difficult, especially when those same assets are already tied up in legal claims and facing potential seizure from multiple directions. The financial empire Trump has spent decades presenting to the world as massive, rock-solid, and untouchable is showing cracks that are starting to look less like cracks and more like the early signs of a total collapse. And the business restrictions that come attached to this judgment pile long-term damage on top of the immediate financial pain. Trump is banned from holding any leadership role at New York businesses for 3 full years. That means no CEO title, no chairman position, no executive role of any kind at companies operating in New York. For a man who built his entire public brand around being the boss, the one who makes the decisions and runs the show, this restriction is genuinely humiliating. He is being formally treated as someone who cannot be trusted with the responsibility of running a business. And according to the fraud findings that the court upheld, that conclusion is completely justified. He lied to banks. He inflated the value of his assets. He carried out persistent, deliberate deception over many years. The business ban is the direct result of that conduct. It is a public declaration to the entire business world that the state of New York does not trust Donald Trump to operate a company honestly, and that ban runs for 3 years, stretching well past the point where his current presidential term would end. The ban on borrowing from New York State banks adds yet another layer of financial pressure on top of everything else. Bank financing is the absolute foundation of any real estate business. You need loans to buy properties, to develop them, and to keep them running. Trump has relied on bank financing throughout his entire career in real estate. Now, with New York banks completely off limits, He cannot borrow from them. He has to go looking for financing elsewhere from institutions that may be far less willing to lend money to someone who is carrying a court-upheld fraud judgment against his name. The reputational damage makes doing business harder, the legal restrictions make operating harder, and the demand for immediate payment threatens his ability to stay financially viable at all. Every single one of these pressures is hitting at the exact same time. The interest that has been building up on this judgment also deserves a moment of attention because it tells a very clear story about how Trump's strategy of constant delay has actually made his situation worse, not better. Every day Trump fought the judgment, every motion his lawyers filed, every appeal he pursued, interest was quietly accumulating on top of the original amount owed. The $364 million figure he now has to pay includes all of that accumulated interest. If Trump had simply accepted the judgment and paid when it was first handed down, he would have owed less. But he chose to fight. He chose to delay, and that choice cost him. The interest kept growing. The total kept climbing. Now he owes more than he ever would have if he had just accepted accountability when it was first demanded. This is the real cost of endless legal fighting. Sometimes dragging things out does not buy you a better outcome. Sometimes it just digs the hole deeper. Trump has built his entire career on using delay as a weapon, stretching out legal battles until the other side runs out of money, energy, or patience. But in this case, delay did not help him. It just made the bill bigger. And this financial judgment does not exist in isolation. It connects directly to and compounds every other legal problem Trump is currently facing. The hush money case, which resulted in 34 felony convictions, is still working its way through the appeals process with its own financial and legal consequences attached. The rulings against his National Guard deployments have found his actions illegal, creating additional potential liability. The contempt situation involving Judge Boasberg threatens further asset seizures tied to his defiance of deportation orders. The loss in the FTC case limits his authority over federal agencies. Everywhere Trump turns right now, there is a court pushing back against him. And now, on top of every single one of those battles, he has to produce $364 million in cash. The combined weight of all these legal problems pressing down at once is enormous. Any one of them alone would be serious. Together, they threaten to overwhelm Trump's ability to function as a businessman, as a politician, and as a defendant trying to manage multiple simultaneous legal fights. The political consequences of all this are just as significant as the financial ones. Running for office and maintaining political influence requires enormous amounts of money. Trump has historically relied on a combination of his personal wealth and his fundraising machine to fuel his political activities. But this civil fraud judgment takes a massive bite directly out of his personal wealth. $364 million is $364 million he cannot put toward campaigns, political organizations, or influence operations. The cash crunch means he may not have access to the money he needs when he needs it for political purposes. The asset freezes mean his properties cannot easily be used as collateral to secure new loans. Trump's financial problems and his political problems are not two separate issues. They are deeply connected. A financially weakened Trump is a politically weakened Trump, and the enforcement of this judgment weakens him in both areas at the same time. All right, let's pull all of this together and talk about what this enforcement order actually means going forward. The judge's decision to demand immediate full payment, no negotiations, no payment plans, with imprisonment threatened for anyone who tries to evade marks the end of delay as a workable strategy in this case. Trump has spent decades using the legal system to avoid being held accountable for anything. He files motions. He appeals every decision. He stretches out proceedings for as long as it takes for the other side to run out of resources or patience. It has worked for him more times than most people realize. But this judge looked at all of that and said enough. The fraud has been proven. The judgment has been confirmed and upheld. The time to pay is now. And if Trump refuses, if he tries to find a way around it, he faces imprisonment. The delay strategy has finally run into a wall it cannot get through. The political fallout heading into the midterms is substantial. Democrats have been making the argument for years that Trump is a fraud, that his image as a wildly successful businessman is built on lies, and that he cheats and deceives to get ahead in life. The civil fraud judgment, now being actively enforced, validates every one of those arguments with an official legal ruling. A judge examined the evidence and concluded that Trump inflated his asset values to deceive banks. That is not a political attack. That is not partisan talking points. That is a legal finding that survived an appeal. Democrats are going to use this relentlessly going into 2026. They will hold up the $364 million judgment as hard proof that Trump is not the business genius he has always claimed to be. They will put the fraud findings front and center. They will make sure voters know about the business ban and the restrictions on bank borrowing. This enforcement gives Democrats concrete, court-validated evidence to back up everything they have been saying about Trump's character. For Republican donors, this creates a set of serious and uncomfortable questions about Trump's financial stability and about the risk of staying too closely tied to him. Major donors have been pouring money behind Trump with an expectation of getting something back: favorable policies, access to power, business advantages. But a Trump who is financially distressed, facing hundreds of millions in court judgments and the potential seizure of his assets, is a Trump who may not be in a position to deliver on any of that. Donors are going to start asking hard questions about whether their support is still a smart investment. They are going to worry about what it does to their own reputation to be closely associated with someone a court has formally found to be a fraudster. Some of them are going to start quietly redirecting their money to other candidates and other causes. The financial pressure on Trump creates political pressure, as the people who fund his operation begin to reconsider where they stand. The risk of asset seizure is what makes this situation truly threatening to everything Trump has built. If he cannot produce $364 million in cash, the court will move to enforce the judgment against his physical assets. Properties will be seized. Real estate will be sold off to satisfy what is owed. Mar-a-Lago, the compound Trump treats as his personal kingdom and the center of his political world, could potentially be taken. Trump Tower, the single most recognizable symbol of his brand and his identity, could be sold. The golf courses that carry his name across the country could end up under new ownership. Everything Trump has spent his life building, everything that forms the foundation of his image as a wealthy and powerful man, is now at genuine risk. And the judge was not making empty threats. The legal mechanisms to seize assets and liquidate them to pay a judgment are real, they exist, and they will be used if Trump does not pay. The threat of imprisonment for attempting to evade the judgment is the element that makes all of this feel truly real rather than theoretical. Civil judgments can sometimes feel like abstract numbers on paper debts that get negotiated, restructured, and kicked down the road indefinitely. But prison is not abstract. Prison is concrete, immediate, and terrifying. The judge made explicitly clear that any attempt to evade this judgment hiding assets, moving money to shield it from the court, flatly refusing to comply could result in a finding of criminal contempt and actual imprisonment. Trump has to take that seriously. His lawyers have to take that seriously. You do not play games with a judge who is putting jail time on the table. The threat of imprisonment forces compliance in a way that purely financial penalties simply might not. Trump may be willing to drag out a money fight indefinitely. He has done it his entire career. But going to jail is a different matter entirely. That threat changes the calculation in a way nothing else has. And this enforcement order does not exist in a vacuum. It fits into a much larger and increasingly clear pattern of legal defeats that together paint a picture of Trump's legal position comprehensively falling apart. The Supreme Court ruled against him in the FTC case. 29 judges unanimously rebuked his position on National Guard deployment issues. Courts have blocked his birthright citizenship order. Courts have ruled his deployments illegal. Judge Boasberg found contempt in the deportation case. And now a New York judge is enforcing a fraud judgment and putting imprisonment on the table. Everywhere Trump turns, he is getting adverse rulings. Every legal strategy he has relied on: delay, appeal, attack the judges publicly, drag everything out — has failed. The walls are closing in from every direction simultaneously. The fraud judgment enforcement is one more wall, one more pressure point, one more crisis added to a pile that was already overwhelming. The way interest accumulated on this judgment also reveals something important about how Trump approaches legal problems. He fights everything. He delays everything. He treats every unfavorable ruling as something to be appealed, contested, and stretched out for as long as possible. And in many situations throughout his career, that approach has worked well for him. But in this case, it backfired badly. The delay meant more interest, more money owed, a deeper hole. If Trump had simply paid the original judgment when it came down, he would have owed significantly less than he owes today. His strategy of endless litigation cost him millions of additional dollars in interest charges alone. That is a cautionary tale about the limits of using delay as an all-purpose strategy. Sometimes cutting your losses early is the smarter move. Sometimes fighting makes the situation worse, not better. Trump's deeply ingrained instinct to never accept defeat, to never settle, to never pay what he owes without a fight, has made this particular situation far worse than it ever needed to be. The business restrictions attached to this judgment also carry long-term consequences that stretch well beyond the immediate financial crisis. For 3 years, Trump cannot lead businesses operating in New York. He cannot borrow from New York state banks. Even if he manages to survive this current financial crunch, these restrictions significantly limit his ability to rebuild. He is being formally treated as someone the courts have found unfit for business leadership, because that is exactly what the fraud findings concluded. That finding does not disappear. Those restrictions do not quietly go away. They follow him. They shape how people in the business world view him. They affect what opportunities are available to him. They affect who is willing to do business with him and on what terms. The fraud judgment is not simply a one-time payment that gets made and forgotten. It is a permanent mark on his record that narrows his options going forward. And the question everyone is now asking is a simple but enormous one. Where does Trump get $364 million? His wealth is largely locked up in real estate properties that cannot be turned into cash quickly or easily. Whatever cash reserves he actually has may not come close to being enough. His ability to borrow new money is already constrained by the fraud judgment itself, and further squeezed by the various legal restrictions and asset freezes that have been placed on his properties across multiple cases. He may be forced to sell major properties at deeply discounted prices just to raise cash fast enough. He may have to go looking for investors willing to step in and bail him out. Any investors willing to step in would almost certainly demand major concessions in return significant cuts of ownership, control, or future profits. He may be forced to accept financial arrangements that dramatically shrink both his actual wealth and his control over the business empire he has spent his life building. There are no good options left on the table. There are only bad options and worse options. And the judge is not giving him the time to sit back and search for creative solutions. The money is due now. I want to take a moment to talk about what this enforcement order means for accountability in a broader sense because it represents something genuinely significant. For decades, Trump has found ways to avoid facing consequences for his behavior. He has used legal maneuvers, delay tactics, and aggressive litigation to slip out of accountability time and time again. He has defaulted on debts. He has broken contracts. He has been accused of fraud and serious misconduct repeatedly throughout his career and repeatedly managed to avoid paying any real price for it. This judgment, being enforced immediately with the threat of imprisonment for non-compliance, represents the system finally catching up with him. A judge has said enough. The fraud has been proven. The money is owed. Pay it now or go to jail. That is accountability. Imperfect? Yes. Long overdue? Absolutely. But real. The very legal system that Trump has spent decades bending to his advantage is finally holding him to account. So here's the bottom line. A New York judge has ordered Donald Trump to pay $364 million immediately in enforcement of the civil fraud judgment against him. No payment plans, no negotiations, no more delays. The judge has made clear that any attempt to evade the judgment or hide assets could result in imprisonment. Trump's legal team walked into court expecting to negotiate and walked out facing an immediate enforcement order they did not see coming. The judgment flows directly from court findings that Trump inflated the value of his assets for years in order to deceive banks' fraud findings that were fully upheld on appeal, even as the total dollar amount was reduced. Trump faces a 3-year ban on holding leadership positions at New York businesses and a ban on borrowing from New York state banks. His assets, potentially including Mar-a-Lago and Trump Tower, are at risk of being seized and sold if he cannot come up with the money. And all of this is landing on top of every other legal battle he is currently fighting: the FTC loss at the Supreme Court, the unanimous rebuke from the 7th Circuit, the National Guard deployment blocks, the contempt situation with Judge Boasberg, and the ongoing hush money conviction appeal. Trump is being squeezed financially and legally from every direction at once. The delay tactics that kept him out of trouble for decades have finally stopped working. A judge has demanded accountability right now, with prison as the stated consequence for refusing to comply. The walls continue to close in. The financial pressure continues to mount. And Trump is now facing the most serious and direct threat to his business empire that he has ever encountered in his life. I will continue following this story closely as the payment deadline passes and as enforcement actions potentially move forward, because what happens to Trump's finances affects everything else about his presidency, his political future, and what comes next.